Hey y'all, it's me again. I'm gonna continue reading from my book, The Secret Lives of the First Ladies. Making up for lost time. Concealed within Dolly Payne Todd, the Quaker was a fashion diva just begging to bust out. And that's exactly what happened when at 26 Dolly was booted out of the Quakers for marrying James Madison. Her wardrobe soon started matching her shiny personality. Extravagant gowns of silk and satin, low-cut dresses to show off the skin to the sleeve, her ample bosom, ooh, and so on. But nothing made Dolly stand out quite like her turbans. She was rarely seen at public gatherings without her head wrapped in one. Its elaborate folds sporting brightly colored feathers up to a foot in height. They soon became nothing of a trend owing to Dolly's enormous popularity, but nobody could carry them off like the Presidentress. Such magnificent finery came at a price, of course. She was rumored to spend $1,000 a year on the turbans alone. Snuff job. Dolly was a devout user of snuff tobacco, often interrupting a moment of social license to sniff up a pinch from her stained fingers. Because ladies rarely embraced such a habit, most of the fellow addicts who dipped into her bejeweled snuff box were men, and it's hardly surprising. The claim required after every dose could look decidedly unladylike. Dolly carried 2 handkerchiefs for the job, a delicate lacy sleeve for pepper, and a thicker one for the messy spots. Carrying a torch. As a Quaker, Dolly was brought up to despise slavery. Her father had freed all of his and even petitioned Congress to outlaw the institution. But her second husband, James Madison, was, like all good Virginia planters, a prominent slave owner. Her personal feelings on the subject remain somewhat vague. On at least one occasion, however, she seems to have forgotten the guiding principles of her childhood. At a reception she threw in 1815 to impress the new British ambassador and to convince him that there were no hard feelings in the wake of the War of 1812, she took great care in creating a festive atmosphere, which included stationing torch holding African slaves throughout the house to provide illumination. One appalled partier described it as a barbarous Egyptian display. Up in flames. With a few painful exceptions, the initial stages of the War of 1812 went fairly well for the young United States. Then the British brought the other arm out from behind their back in 1814 and decided to get serious. That summer they landed an army on the American coast. Its goal was clear, the federal capital at Washington, but its commander, Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn, had an even more specific objective in mind. Dolly Madison. Cockburn had publicly announced his intention of capturing the First Lady, taking her back to England, where she was to be paraded through the streets of London as a war prize. By the time the British radicals were making a stir on the outskirts of Washington, Dolly was on her own at the White House. Jimmy had departed to be with the troops, who incidentally were getting their tails kicked by Cockburn's Scarlet professionals. After ascending to the roof of the presidential mansion and watching the fireworks through a spyglass, Dolly decided, spurred by a letter from Jimmy using her to flee, that it was time to get while the getting was good. She directed the search to gather some vegetables, including a pair of beautiful red curtains and the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, and flee before the arrival of the enemy. During the evening of August 24th, Cockburn and his party arrived at the White House looking for Dolly. They had to sell instead for the dinner she had laid out before fleeing, which they proceeded to devour. Cockburn, his prize having eluded him, settled for one of her seat cushions so that he could be reminded of her seat, he rumored to have said, which he took with him before ordering that the place be torched. The burning of the White House was an insult to every American, but Dolly took it particularly hard. Fortunately, she found a clever and stylish way to cope. Dolly took the expensive records that were rescued prior to her flight from the mansion and had made into a gorgeous new gown. To be worn, of course, at functions celebrating victory over the British. Money matters. Those who paid a visit to Dolly Madison in their twilight years in Washington typically left a little money somewhere in her Lafayette Square home before taking their leave. For as everybody knew, despite her legendary status and powerful friends, the capital's grand dame was a virtual pauper. It hadn't always been so, of course. Both of her husbands had been wealthy men, but James Madison's multiplier estate began to lose money even before his death in 1836, and would continue to drop in value long afterward. In fact, one of the primary reasons for Dolly's return to Washington after Jimmy died was to peddle his papers to Congress, encompassing the great Madison's career, reflections, and accomplishments. The papers were surely worth $100,000, or so she thought. In 1837, after watching the poor old widow pester everyone who would listen about getting a good price for Jimmy's memoirs, Congress finally gave her $30,000 for part of them. Yikes. It wasn't a bad sum, but Dolly's financial problems were unusually nasty, due in large part to her son, John Payne Todd, who had grown up to become every mother's worst nightmare. A drunken, quarrelsome, philandering fool. Even worse, he was addicted to gambling and had a habit of losing at it. James Madison, before he died, estimated that he had lost around $40,000 to his stepson's insatiable lifestyle and stints in debtor's prison. Things just got worse when Jimmy was gone. Dolly never could say no to her son. Fortunately, Congress could. Perhaps out of pity, they bought the rest of Madison's papers from her for $25,000 in 1847, but they kept the money saved from Payne Todd by putting it in a trust fund that only Dolly could use. Payne Todd actually had the girl to show up in Washington, threatened the manager of the trust with physical harm. His poor old mom had to beg him not to make things worse than he already had. Sadly, the funds came only a year and a half before her death. Damn. Chapter 4. Elizabeth Monroe. June 30th, 1768 through September 23rd, 1830. Married February 16th, 1786. 2 days after Valentine's Day. Nice. I had to count. Sorry. Presidential husband, James Monroe. Children, Eliza Courtright, Jane Spence, and Maria Hester. First Lady, from 1817 to 1825. Astrological sign, Cancer. Religion, Episcopalian. I think that's how you say it. I don't know. Oh no, all the different religions. But no comment. All of Monroe's correspondence was burned soon after her death. Little is known about America's fourth First Lady, largely because her correspondence was burned shortly after her death, and neither her husband nor daughters wrote extensively about her during their lifetimes. This much is certain, though: she had the audacious task of succeeding the legendary Dolly Madison, and possessing none of Queen Dolly's beloved qualities. She pretty much messed things up. Elizabeth Monroe suffered from a mysterious falling sickness that was never properly diagnosed. On one occasion, she would tumble into a burning fireplace. Yikes. Elizabeth Courtright had unlikely origins for a future American First Lady. Her father, Lawrence Courtright, was a wealthy merchant and British loyalist, and he had a son, Elizabeth's brother, who wore a red uniform during the Revolution. But the Courtrights patiently ate their crow after the war and remained in New York, where they were prominent members of the Mercantile Elite. Elizabeth was raised with all the aristocratic trappings that her family was could afford. It created in her a tendency towards snobbery that would one day bite her in her blue-blooded rear end. By the time she was 16, she would become a refined, dark-haired beauty who could have her pick of suitors. She ended up choosing James Monroe, a Virginia delegate to the Confederation Congress, being held in 1785 in the temporary capital of New York City. Like most landed Virginians, Monroe had plenty of land and slaves, but very little cash. A fact that drove many of Elizabeth's friends and family to accuse her of courting beneath her station. She calmly rebuffed him and married the fellow in 1786. The newlyweds moved to Virginia, where James started practicing law to put more money in his pocket, but the law of politics proved irresistible, and he soon ended up serving as a U.S. Senator. Then in 1794, the Washington administration made him minister of to France, and the Monroes were off to Europe. The new minister and his wife embraced the culture of the new French surroundings with what can only be called fascism. Elizabeth felt right at home among the culture and refinery of the French, who soon embraced her as La Belle Americaine. The couple enrolled their daughter Eliza in a French school, learned to speak the language fluently, and almost started regretting that they would one day have to return to America. That day didn't come until 1797, by which time the Monroes had become as French as any Americans could ever be. Elizabeth watched her husband get elected governor of Virginia, then bore a son who died of whooping cough during infancy. It was enough for her to start pining for the courts of Europe, and she didn't have to wait long. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sent James back to France to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase with Napoleon. The mission in France was just the beginning of a tour of duty that would take James to London, Madrid, and other European cities on diplomatic service. But none of them held the appeal for Elizabeth of her beloved France. In London, for instance, the Monroes were routinely sniped for being representatives of an upstart little country, although whenever she attended the opera, they always welcomed her by playing Yankee Doodle. After returning to America, Monroe became Virginia's governor again in 1811, then resigned to assume the role of James Madison Secretary of State. By 1816, he was important enough to realize his dreams of being president and was elected to a term that would become known as the Era of Good Feelings for its conspicuous lack of partisan squabbling. Good feelings, however, were soon lacking among the prominent members of Washington society. The cause was the presidential spouse. She was haughty, formal, and, well, not Dolly Madison. Elizabeth blamed her aloofness and lack of entertaining on ill health and White House that was still recovering from its 1814 destruction, but nobody really believed her. She revised Dolly's custom of initiating social relations with society folk and the diplomatic corps, preferring instead that they call on her. They not only failed to do so, but went so far as to boycott official presidential functions. And on those few occasions when they did attend, Elizabeth made things worse by being a no-show. Instead, she delegated a White House hostess duties to her eldest daughter, Eliza. Things got bad enough to draw the attention of Monroe's cabinet, who feared the situation would mess up their relationship with Congress. Little came of it, though, and White House recession, in which the elaborately dressed first lady, when she bothered to attend, greeted guests with a curt nod, continued to show dismissal of attendance. Indeed, some of those who managed to come were actually turned away by guards posted by daughter Eliza to reject those who weren't properly dressed. Seemingly nothing that Elizabeth did could make things better. She oversaw the refurbishment of the White House, but the European-style furniture she used, much of it bought from disenfranchised French nobility, merely made the mansion look more aristocratic to American eyes, and the First Lady's famous beauty, she seemed incapable of aging, just inflamed the jealousy of Washington women. Though Elizabeth had her admirers, particularly among the European diplomats who appreciated her class conscience and refinement, she never did win the devotion of American populace who viewed her as mysterious and unapproachable. She preceded her husband James to grief by 10 months, succumbing to the illnesses upon which she had blamed her career of public absences. Please rate, comment, and subscribe down below, and if you're on YouTube, please ring that bell notification so you can know when I upload. And if you're on TikTok, please like and follow my videos, and please pay for something on my either on my eBay or Mercari. And if you want my username for that, comment down below. Okay, bye.